Outside one of Atlanta's most prestigious luxury hotels, an elderly black man in worn clothes stood quietly beneath the glow of 1,000 string lights, while a group of wealthy white socialites laughed and insisted he did not belong anywhere near their charity gala. Every guest who passed him turned their face away, as though his presence alone might stain their expensive gowns and tailored suits. Only one woman refused to look away. She was elegant, composed, and utterly unimpressed by the crowd's cruelty, and without a single dramatic gesture, she stepped between the old man and his tormentors, removed her own coat, and settled it gently over his shoulders. She invited him inside with a warmth that asked for nothing in return, never once suspecting that the frail stranger the entire room despised was not a homeless wanderer at all, but the beloved father of the very billionaire whose name was engraved above the hotel's golden doors. Before that winter night ended, every insult spoken in that courtyard would return tenfold to the people who spoke it, and one simple act of kindness would rearrange the course of countless lives forever. Atlanta in December wore its lights like jewelry, and nowhere did the city glitter more than along the private drive of the Ashcombe Grand, a hotel so exclusive that even its valets were rumored to earn 6 figures a year. On this particular evening, the entire block had been closed to traffic for the Winter Hearts Gala, an annual charity event where the city's wealthiest families gathered beneath crystal chandeliers to raise money for causes. They rarely thought about the other 364 days of the year. Photographers lined the red carpet. Champagne flowed before guests had even stepped through the doors. Among the crowd of furs and diamonds walked a woman named Nia Brooks, 34 years old, the owner of a modest but growing catering company that had, against considerable odds, landed a small contract to help coordinate dessert service for the evening. She was not the richest woman in that courtyard, nor the most photographed, nor even a guest of any particular importance, but she carried herself with a quiet dignity that made people notice her anyway, the kind of presence that came not from wealth, but from character. Nia had grown up believing something simple and unshakable, that every person deserved to be treated with respect, regardless of what they wore or how much money sat in their pocket, a lesson her grandmother had drilled into her since childhood, in the kitchen of a small diner in Savannah. That belief had followed her into adulthood, shaping the way she ran her business, the way she spoke to strangers, and the way she reacted when she saw injustice unfolding in front of her, which was exactly what happened the moment she noticed the old man standing near the hotel's side entrance. His name was Samuel Carter, a man well past 70 years old, dressed in a coat that had clearly seen better decades, and shoes so worn the soles had begun to separate from the leather. He walked with the careful, measured steps of someone whose knees had carried more weight than they were built for, yet his face held a gentleness that seemed entirely out of place among the sharp, glittering crowd surrounding him. Nobody at that gala knew who he was. Nobody bothered to ask. Within minutes, a cluster of guests had gathered near him, 5 people in total, all polished, all wealthy, and all radiating the particular kind of arrogance that comes from never once being told no. They wore their status like armor, and they had decided, without conversation or hesitation, that Samuel Carter's presence was an embarrassment to their carefully curated evening. One woman, dripping in emeralds, wrinkled her nose as though the old man carried some contagious poverty that might spread if he stood too close. A man in a tuxedo laughed loudly enough for the valets to hear, joking that someone should check whether the gala had started handing out invitations to the local shelter. Another guest waved toward hotel security, demanding in a clipped, entitled tone that the man be escorted off the property before he ruined the photographs. Through all of it, Samuel Carter said nothing. He simply lowered his eyes, the way a man does when he has absorbed insults so many times before that reacting no longer seems worth the effort. It was at that exact moment that Nia Brooks stopped walking. She did not shout. She did not create a scene. At least not at first, because scenes were not her way of doing things. Instead, she walked directly toward the small crowd, with the calm assurance of someone who had never once needed permission to do the right thing, and she asked, simply and clearly, what exactly the old man had done wrong. The question landed heavier than any accusation could have, because none of them had an answer that did not expose their own ugliness. Without waiting for a response, Nia positioned herself between Samuel and the group, took the wool coat off her own shoulders and wrapped it gently around his, as though the cold winter air itself had no right to touch him while she stood there. She offered him her arm and quietly invited him to come inside with her, to warm up, to have something hot to drink, to simply exist somewhere he would not be treated like an intrusion. For the first time that entire evening, Samuel Carter smiled. A small, tired, grateful smile that seemed to carry decades of weight behind it. As Nia guided him gently toward the entrance, one of the women in the group leaned toward her friends and murmured just loud enough to be heard, suggesting that if Nia insisted on helping a man like that, perhaps she should simply leave the gala along with him. The comment hung in the cold air like a challenge, sharp and deliberate, meant to embarrass Nia back into silence. She did not turn around. She did not offer a clever retort. She simply kept walking, Samuel's hand resting lightly on her arm, leaving the group behind to stew in the discomfort of their own cruelty, unaware that the night had only just begun to reveal itself. Inside the warmth of the hotel lobby, away from the biting December wind, the contrast between kindness and contempt grew even sharper, because the same group of guests who had mocked Samuel outside had followed them in, apparently unwilling to let the matter rest. They continued their commentary in hushed but pointed tones, suggesting to anyone nearby that the old man had likely wandered in from the street hoping for free food, or perhaps intended to beg from the wealthy attendees once he had warmed himself sufficiently. One woman, in a deep red gown, remarked, almost proudly, that people like him tend to ruin events like this, simply by existing near them, a statement so casually cruel that even a few of the surrounding guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Samuel absorbed each comment the way rain rolls off a stone that has weathered storms for years, his head bowed slightly, his silence unbroken, offering no argument, no defense, nothing but a patience that seemed almost otherworldly given the circumstances. Nia, however, found her tolerance thinning with every passing insult. She had spent her entire adult life building a business rooted in service and hospitality, believing that the way people treated waitstaff, strangers, and the vulnerable revealed more about their character than any bank statement ever could, and watching this unfold in real time tested every ounce of composure she had cultivated. She finally turned to the group, her voice steady but firm, and asked them plainly to treat him like a human being, nothing more and nothing less. The request was so simple, so undeniably reasonable, that it left several of them momentarily speechless, unable to justify their behavior without sounding exactly as petty as they were being. Samuel lifted his eyes toward Nia in that moment, and something passed across his face that looked remarkably like gratitude, mixed with quiet astonishment, as though he had not expected anyone in that room to stand up for him so plainly. As the tension lingered, Samuel said something strange, almost to himself, remarking quietly that he had watched this building grow for decades, his eyes drifting toward the high ceilings and gleaming marble columns of the lobby as though he were seeing something none of the other guests could perceive. Nia glanced at him curiously, uncertain what he meant, but before she could ask him to explain, a low murmur rippled through the crowd near the entrance. Outside, beyond the tall glass doors, a sleek black limousine had begun making its way up the private drive, flanked by a small convoy of security vehicles, and the mood of the entire gala shifted instantly, as though someone had flipped a switch. Guests straightened their posture. Conversations dropped to whispers. Even the group that had spent the last 20 minutes tormenting an old man suddenly seemed far more interested in whoever was arriving than in continuing their cruelty. Word rippled through the crowd, with the speed only true anticipation can create, because everyone understood exactly who was expected that evening, even if almost none of them had ever actually met the person in question face to face. The Ashcombe Grand, along with its foundation and a substantial portion of the charitable funds being raised that night, belonged to one of the most powerful and famously private business figures in the entire country, a chief executive whose rise from obscurity to extraordinary success had become the subject of countless magazine profiles, none of which had ever managed to secure a personal interview. Rumors about this person circulated constantly, each one more exaggerated than the last, painting a picture of someone brilliant, untouchable, and impossibly guarded. Tonight, for reasons no one fully understood, That same reclusive figure had chosen to attend in person, and the entire ballroom buzzed with a nervous, electric excitement that made even the wealthiest attendees fuss over their appearance one final time. Samuel, oddly enough, seemed entirely unaffected by the commotion. While everyone else adjusted their jewelry and rehearsed polite greetings in their minds, he simply stood near one of the tall windows, gazing out at the hotel's grand facade with an expression of quiet familiarity, the way a person looks at a home they have not visited in years, but never truly forgotten. Nia, still standing beside him, found herself curious, despite the chaos building around them, and she asked gently whether he had once worked at the hotel, since he seemed to know the place so intimately. Samuel only smiled, offering no direct answer, but instead began recalling small, oddly specific details about the building: the placement of an old fountain that had since been removed, the original color of the lobby walls before a renovation years earlier, memories so precise that they could not possibly belong to a casual passerby. While Samuel spoke softly of the past, the hotel's event coordinators moved through the ballroom in a barely contained panic, double-checking every table setting, every flower arrangement, every detail that might reflect poorly should the mysterious owner decide to inspect the evening personally. Waitstaff rushed past with trays held higher than usual. Security guards repositioned themselves near the entrances, and even the orchestra seemed to play with slightly more precision, as though sensing the importance of the moment. Amid all this frantic preparation, Samuel remained exactly where he was, calm and unbothered, still wrapped in the coat Nia had given him, watching the spectacle unfold with the quiet amusement of someone who had seen this particular kind of chaos many times before in his life. It was during this flurry of preparation that one of the hotel's senior managers, a sharply dressed man who had worked at the Ashcombe Grand for nearly 15 years, happened to glance across the lobby and catch sight of Samuel standing near the window. Something about the old man's face struck him immediately, a flicker of recognition he could not quite place, as though he were looking at someone he had met once, long ago, under very different circumstances. He paused mid-stride, staring a moment too long, his professional composure slipping just slightly before he shook his head and continued walking, telling himself it was simply exhaustion from the evening's stress playing tricks on his memory. He would not be given the luxury of dismissing that feeling for long. The uneasy recognition that had briefly crossed the manager's face refused to fade as the evening wore on, and every few minutes he found his eyes drifting back toward the old man standing quietly near the window, certain he had seen that face somewhere before, yet unable to place exactly where or when. He busied himself with logistics, checking guest lists, and confirming seating arrangements, but the nagging familiarity followed him like a shadow he could not shake loose. Meanwhile, Samuel politely declined every offer to be shown further into the ballroom, insisting instead that he preferred to remain exactly where he was, near the entrance, saying only that he simply wanted to watch the people arrive and see how the evening unfolded before deciding whether he wished to stay any longer. It was an odd request from a man everyone assumed had wandered in off the street, yet something about the calm certainty in his voice made even the staff hesitate to push the matter further. Nia remained close by his side throughout, not out of obligation, but because something about Samuel's presence felt worth staying near, a kind of stillness that contrasted sharply with the frantic energy filling the rest of the hotel. The two of them fell into easy conversation, the kind that happens naturally between strangers who sense they can trust one another without needing to explain why. Samuel asked her gently about her life, her work, the catering business she had built from nothing, and Nia found herself sharing more than she usually would with someone she had just met, describing the early struggles of her company, the contracts that had fallen through, the nights she had questioned whether she should give up entirely and take a stable job somewhere else instead. Samuel listened with a rare kind of attentiveness, nodding at the right moments, asking thoughtful questions that showed he was truly absorbing every word rather than simply waiting for his turn to speak. As their conversation deepened, small details began to surface that hinted this was no ordinary old man who had simply lost his way into a gala he did not belong at. He spoke with unexpected insight about running a business, about the sacrifices required to build something lasting, about the difference between people who chased money and people who chased meaning, wisdom, that seemed to come from lived experience rather than casual observation. Naya found herself increasingly curious about who exactly Samuel Carter was, though she never once considered pressing him for answers he did not seem ready to give. Instead, she simply enjoyed the conversation for what it was, comforted by his presence in a room that had otherwise made her feel like an outsider among people who valued appearances over substance. It was in the middle of this quiet exchange that Samuel reached into the inner pocket of his worn coat and pulled out a small, old-fashioned pocket watch, its metal casing dulled with age, but its craftsmanship still evident beneath the wear. Etched faintly into the surface was a symbol Nia did not immediately recognize. An emblem that closely resembled the same logo, displayed prominently across the hotel's marble entryway and embroidered subtly into the staff uniforms moving throughout the lobby. Samuel held it gently, almost reverently, running his thumb across the engraving, as though the object carried memories far heavier than its physical weight. And for just a moment, Nia sensed that this small watch meant something far more significant than a simple accessory. Before she could ask him about it, the same group that had tormented Samuel earlier reappeared, apparently unable to leave well enough alone, even as the gala's most anticipated guest was moments away from arriving. One of the men, emboldened by champagne and arrogance in equal measure, snatched the pocket watch directly from Samuel's weathered hands before anyone could react. He turned it over mockingly, declaring loudly to his friends that it was obviously a cheap imitation, a worthless trinket. Some homeless man had probably scavenged from a pawnshop bin, and with a careless flick of his wrist, he tossed it onto the marble floor as though it meant nothing at all. The sound of metal striking stone echoed sharply through the lobby, and Samuel's face crumpled with a pain that had nothing to do with the object itself, and everything to do with what it represented. Nia felt something inside her snap in that instant, the composure she had maintained throughout the entire evening finally giving way to genuine fury. For the first time that night, her voice rose above a whisper, and she demanded to know what kind of person found joy in humiliating an elderly man who had done absolutely nothing to deserve such treatment. Nearby security guards moved cautiously toward the escalating situation, clearly uncertain how to handle a conflict between paying guests and an old man nobody could properly identify, hesitating in that particular way institutions often do when status and decency come into direct conflict. The lobby buzzed with tension, onlookers whispering amongst themselves, unsure whether to intervene or simply watch the spectacle unfold. It was precisely at that moment, with Samuel kneeling slightly to retrieve his fallen watch and Nia standing protectively beside him, that a hush fell suddenly over the entire lobby. Outside, the black limousine had finally come to a stop directly in front of the hotel's grand entrance, and every head in the building turned toward the doors in collective anticipation. Cameras that had been idle all evening suddenly sprang to life. The orchestra, sensing the moment, softened its music to something more ceremonial. And as the limousine door opened, and the long-awaited chief executive stepped out into the cold December air, the woman's gaze swept across the crowded entrance and landed almost immediately on the old man kneeling near the marble floor. She froze mid-step, one foot still on the pavement outside, her carefully composed expression collapsing into something raw and unguarded in a way none of the assembled guests had ever witnessed from someone so famously private. The chief executive of the Ashcombe Grand, and the woman whose business empire had made her one of the most powerful figures in the country, was not who anyone in that lobby had expected. Her name was Monica Carter, 38 years old, and she was black, a fact that alone sent a ripple of stunned silence through a crowd that had spent the entire evening assuming certain things about who belonged in spaces of wealth and who did not. But it was not simply her arrival that stole every breath in the room. It was the recognition flashing across her face as her eyes locked onto the old man in the worn coat, kneeling on her hotel's marble floor. Monica moved before anyone could stop her, abandoning every protocol her security team had carefully arranged for her entrance, pushing past photographers and stunned guests alike, as though they were nothing more than furniture in her path. She crossed the lobby in seconds, her expensive heels clicking urgently against the stone, and dropped to her knees beside Samuel without a single thought for her designer gown or the cameras capturing every second of the moment. She wrapped her arms around him tightly, her voice breaking as she whispered the word that explained everything in an instant, calling him simply and unmistakably her father. The entire courtyard fell into a silence so complete that the soft crackle of camera shutters seemed impossibly loud in comparison. The group of guests who had spent the evening tormenting Samuel went pale almost instantly, the color draining from their faces as the full weight of what they had done settled over them like a physical blow. Hotel security straightened immediately, their earlier confusion replaced with rigid, uncomfortable attention, suddenly aware they had nearly escorted the father of their employer out of his own daughter's hotel. Nia stood frozen as well, her mind racing to reconcile the quiet, humble old man she had spent the evening speaking with and the reality that he was, in fact, the father of one of the most powerful women in the country. Samuel, through it all, simply smiled at his daughter with the same gentle warmth he had shown Nia from the very beginning, utterly unsurprised by the commotion his presence had caused. Monica rose slowly, keeping one arm wrapped protectively around her father's shoulders, and turned to face the crowd with an expression that had shifted from raw emotion into something far more controlled and dangerous. The calm of a woman who built empires and did not tolerate cruelty toward the people she loved. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was steady and clear, carrying easily across the silent lobby without needing to be raised. She asked simply who exactly had done this to her father, who had mocked him, who had thrown his belongings to the ground, who had decided he did not belong in a building that literally bore her family's legacy. Nobody among the group who had tormented Samuel found the courage to answer. Their silence spoke louder than any confession could have. As the weight of the moment settled over the ballroom, the hotel's security team quietly began reviewing the extensive camera footage that had captured nearly every moment of the evening, footage that would soon reveal, in painful clarity, exactly what had transpired outside and within the lobby. Monica remained close to her father throughout, refusing to leave his side, even as hotel staff hovered nervously nearby, awaiting instructions. But for the moment, she seemed far less interested in punishment than in simply understanding how this had happened. She guided Samuel gently to a quiet seating area away from the crowd, and it was there, surrounded by trusted staff and Nia, who found herself invited to remain despite having no idea why she deserved such treatment, that the truth of Samuel Carter's life slowly began to unfold. Samuel had not always been a man dressed in worn coats and weathered shoes, though that image suited him just as comfortably as any tailored suit ever could. Decades earlier, he had worked himself nearly to exhaustion, holding down 3 separate jobs at once, cleaning offices before dawn, driving delivery trucks through the afternoon, and washing dishes late into the night, all so that his only daughter could attend a proper university without the burden of debt weighing down her future. When money ran short during Monica's second year of college, Samuel had sold the small house he and his late wife had spent 20 years building together, a home filled with memories he treasured more than any possession, simply because his daughter's education mattered more to him than sentimental walls and a roof. He never once told her the full extent of that sacrifice until many years later, and even then, only reluctantly, because he never wanted his daughter to feel burdened by guilt over choices he considered entirely his own to make. Monica, of course, had known some of this even as a young woman, watching her father come home exhausted night after night, his hands cracked and calloused from labor most people never had to consider. Yet she had not understood the full depth of his sacrifice until she was old enough to piece together the years and the numbers and the house that quietly disappeared from her childhood memories. She had built her business empire from the ground up, with that sacrifice as her foundation, carrying her father's work ethic and quiet humility into every decision she made. And she often told people, whenever the subject arose, that her father was the man who had built the very life she now lived, brick by exhausting brick, without ever once asking for recognition or reward. What confused nearly everyone in that lobby, however, was why a man whose daughter owned this very hotel would choose to dress so plainly and wander its grounds unnoticed, rather than simply announcing himself and enjoying every comfort his daughter's success could easily provide. The answer, as Monica explained gently to the small gathered group, was rooted entirely in who Samuel had always been as a person. He preferred simplicity to luxury, choosing modest clothing, not out of necessity, but out of genuine comfort, uninterested in the trappings of wealth that so many others chased relentlessly. He often walked through the city on his own, observing people, listening to conversations, watching how strangers treated one another when they believed no one of importance was paying attention, because he believed that a person's true character revealed itself most honestly in those unguarded, unwatched moments. Nia listened to all of this with a growing lump in her throat, understanding now why Samuel had spoken so knowledgeably about the hotel earlier, why he had seemed so at peace, despite the humiliation directed at him throughout the evening, and why his eyes had carried such quiet wisdom during their conversation. She felt no regret whatsoever for having helped him, but she did feel a profound wave of emotion, realizing just how easily kindness and cruelty had been separated by nothing more than a person's willingness to look past worn clothing and see the human being underneath. Samuel reached over and gently patted her hand, as though sensing exactly what she was feeling, offering silent reassurance that her actions that evening had mattered far more than she yet realized. Monica, meanwhile, requested that hotel security bring forward the full security footage from earlier in the evening, wanting not vengeance but clarity, a complete and undeniable record of exactly what had occurred before she took any further action. The request was carried out swiftly, and within minutes, a large screen near the ballroom's private lounge had been prepared to display the footage for a small, carefully selected audience that included hotel management, the individuals responsible for the evening's cruelty, and a few witnesses whose honesty could not be questioned. The mood in the room shifted from tension into something closer to dread as the footage began to play, because everyone present understood that whatever appeared on that screen could not be denied, explained away, or softened with excuses. The video played in unforgiving clarity, capturing every sneer, every mocking comment, every dismissive gesture the group of wealthy guests had directed at Samuel throughout the evening. It showed the woman in emeralds wrinkling her nose in disgust as though his very presence offended her senses. It captured the man in the tuxedo laughing cruelly while suggesting Samuel had wandered in from a homeless shelter. It recorded, with painful precision, the moment someone snatched the pocket watch from his hands and threw it carelessly to the marble floor, dismissing it as a worthless imitation without a single thought for what it might mean to the man holding it. Nobody in that room could argue against what their own actions, captured plainly on camera, revealed about their character. Monica watched every second of the footage without interruption, her expression remaining remarkably composed despite what must have been an overwhelming urge to react with anger toward the people who had humiliated her father. When the recording finally ended, she did not raise her voice, did not launch into an accusatory speech, and did not indulge in the kind of dramatic confrontation the tense silence of the room seemed to anticipate. Instead, she spoke calmly and deliberately, her words carrying far more weight, because of the restraint behind them, stating simply that character reveals itself most honestly in the moments when a person believes no one of importance is watching. The room absorbed her words in complete silence, the truth of the statement settling over everyone present like an unavoidable verdict. The consequences that followed were swift and entirely justified, though Monica handled each one with the same measured composure she had shown throughout the evening, refusing to let personal anger dictate decisions that needed to remain fair and appropriate. The guests who had mocked and humiliated Samuel were quietly asked to leave the gala immediately, escorted out not with public shaming but with a firm, unmistakable finality that left no room for negotiation. Several of them, it soon became clear, held business relationships with companies connected to Monica's broader corporate network, relationships that began quietly dissolving in the days that followed as word of their behavior spread through professional circles that valued reputation above almost everything else. Within the tightly connected social world of Atlanta's elite, whispers about their cruelty spread quickly, and the same status they had relied upon to mock an old man became the very currency that began working against them. Once the group had been escorted from the property, and the initial shock of the evening's revelations had begun to settle, Monica turned her attention toward Nia, studying her for a long, quiet moment, with an expression that mixed genuine curiosity with something close to admiration. She asked directly why Nia had chosen to intervene earlier that evening, why she had stepped forward to defend a stranger when so many others had simply looked away or actively participated in his humiliation. Nia considered the question carefully before answering, her response simple and unpretentious, stating only that kindness should never depend on someone's social status or the way they happened to be dressed, and that she could not have lived with herself had she stood by and done nothing while another human being was treated so poorly. Samuel, listening quietly beside his daughter, felt his eyes fill with tears at Nia's answer, moved not by grand gestures or eloquent speeches, but by the simple, unshakable sincerity behind her words. Monica nodded slowly, clearly impressed by the young woman's conviction, and after a brief pause, she extended an offer that caught everyone in the room off guard, proposing that Nia consider taking on the role of director for the charitable foundation connected to the Ashcombe Grand and its broader business holdings. It was not, Monica clarified gently, an offer made simply as a reward for her kindness toward Samuel, but rather a recognition that her values aligned precisely with the kind of leadership the foundation desperately needed moving forward. To the surprise of nearly everyone present, Nia did not immediately accept the offer, despite its obvious prestige and the life-changing opportunity it represented for someone running a modest catering business. She explained, with the same honesty that had defined her actions all evening, that she wanted to earn such a position through demonstrated ability rather than receive it purely because of a single act of kindness performed under unusual circumstances. She wanted to prove herself capable of the responsibility being offered, not simply accept it as a gift born from a fortunate coincidence. Monica's respect for the young woman only deepened at this response, recognizing in Nia the same quiet integrity that had defined her own father's life for as long as she could remember. As the evening moved past its initial chaos, and the gala slowly resumed some semblance of normalcy, Samuel requested a brief moment to address the remaining guests, a request Monica granted immediately, despite the unconventional nature of an unannounced speech from a man nobody had known was connected to the hotel just hours earlier. He walked slowly toward the small stage set up near the ballroom, declining assistance despite his evident exhaustion, and stood before a crowd that had spent the entire evening alternating between confusion, guilt, and quiet awe at everything that had unfolded. Samuel spoke without notes, his voice soft but carrying clearly through the now attentive room, describing the years he had spent raising his daughter alone after losing his wife far too young, the sacrifices that had felt insignificant to him at the time, simply because they were made out of love rather than obligation. He explained that he had always taught Monica one central lesson throughout her childhood, a belief he had carried with him his entire life, that a person's greatest possession was never measured in wealth or status, but rather in how they chose to treat those with less power than themselves. He glanced toward Nia as he spoke these words, a small, grateful smile crossing his tired face, acknowledging silently that she had lived out that exact principle without knowing anything about who he truly was. Monica stepped forward once her father finished speaking, taking his hand gently and turning to address the gathered crowd herself, her voice thick with an emotion she rarely allowed herself to display so publicly. She thanked her father, not for anything grand or extraordinary in the traditional sense, but for the quiet, unglamorous sacrifices that had shaped every success she had achieved throughout her career, reminding everyone present that behind every powerful figure often stood someone whose labor and love went largely unseen and unrewarded. The room, filled with people who had arrived that evening, focused entirely on appearances and status, found themselves moved by a story that had nothing to do with either. The applause that followed was immediate and overwhelming, guests rising from their seats in a spontaneous standing ovation that seemed to catch even Monica slightly off guard, though it was clear the gesture was directed as much toward Nia as it was toward Samuel and his daughter. Several guests approached Nia throughout the remainder of the evening, offering words of admiration for her courage earlier that night, admiration that felt entirely different from the empty flattery so common among the city's elite, because it was rooted in genuine respect for what she had done when no reward had been guaranteed. Before the evening drew to its close, Monica announced several initiatives that would emerge directly from what had transpired that night, initiatives she had clearly been considering, even as the earlier chaos unfolded around her family. She revealed the creation of a new foundation, specifically dedicated to supporting elderly individuals facing financial hardship, a cause deeply personal to her, given everything her own father had sacrificed and endured throughout his life. She announced a comprehensive training program that would be implemented across every property and business under her company's control, focused entirely on dignity, respect, and the elimination of discrimination based on appearance or social status, ensuring that no employee or guest would ever again witness the kind of cruelty Samuel had experienced earlier that evening without consequence. Finally, she introduced what she called a company-wide policy, a simple but powerful standard she intended to enforce across every level of her business empire, one that placed respect above status in every interaction, regardless of who someone appeared to be or what they happened to be wearing. The guests who had participated in Samuel's humiliation earlier that night, several of whom had lingered awkwardly at the edges of the ballroom hoping to salvage some remnant of their social standing, quietly gathered their belongings and slipped out of the hotel without drawing further attention to themselves, the weight of public shame, accomplishing what no formal punishment could have achieved quite so effectively. Their absence went largely unnoticed by the rest of the crowd, who remained far more captivated by the remarkable story that had unfolded before them than by the departure of a few embarrassed socialites. As the gala finally wound down and guests began filtering out into the cold Atlanta night, Samuel and Nia found themselves standing together once more outside the grand entrance of the hotel, in almost the exact spot where their unlikely friendship had first begun just hours earlier, under far less favorable circumstances. The contrast between that initial moment of cruelty and the warmth now surrounding them felt almost impossible to reconcile. Yet there they stood, two strangers turned friends, watching the city lights shimmer against the winter sky. Samuel turned to her with a quiet, knowing smile, offering a piece of wisdom that seemed to summarize everything the evening had taught them both, remarking gently that people tend to remember success for only a season, but they remember kindness for an entire lifetime. Nia smiled back at him, feeling a warmth that had nothing to do with the coat, now returned to her shoulders, and everything to do with the profound shift that had occurred within her over the course of one unforgettable evening. Moments later, Monica emerged from the hotel as well, having finally managed to excuse herself from the flurry of remaining guests and staff, still buzzing about everything that had transpired, and she joined her father and Nia at the entrance, standing quietly between them, as though she had always belonged there. The three of them remained together for a long while, saying little, simply watching as the city of Atlanta glittered beneath the winter sky, each of them carrying away something different from the night, yet united by the same simple truth that had brought them together in the first place, that dignity costs nothing to give and everything to withhold, and that the smallest acts of kindness often carry consequences far larger than anyone could ever predict in the moment they choose to act. In the weeks that followed, word of what had happened outside the Ashcombe Grand spread quietly but persistently through the city, not as gossip meant to entertain, but as a story people found themselves retelling, because it reminded them of something they wanted to believe was still true about the world. Nia's small catering business began receiving inquiries from clients she never could have reached on her own merit alone months earlier, not because anyone was doing her a favor, but because people who had witnessed her character that night wanted to be associated with someone who lived by principles rather than convenience. She continued turning down further offers from Monica's company for several months, insisting on building her own path forward, until eventually, after proving herself through sheer determination and consistent excellence, she accepted a position within the foundation on terms she herself had negotiated, terms built on merit rather than gratitude. Samuel, for his part, returned to his familiar, quiet life, still walking the streets of Atlanta in his simple clothes, still observing the world with the same patient, unhurried curiosity that had defined him for decades, though now he did so with the comfort of knowing that at least one stranger in this vast, often indifferent city had proven that decency still existed in places one might least expect to find it. He and Nia remained close in the years that followed, their friendship growing steadily from that single chance encounter into something neither of them had anticipated, but both had come to treasure deeply, a bond built not on obligation or circumstance, but on the simple recognition of shared values. Monica, meanwhile, carried the lesson of that evening into every decision she made from that point forward, ensuring that the policies she had announced that night were not simply symbolic gestures made in the heat of an emotional moment, but genuine, lasting changes woven into the very foundation of her business empire. She often spoke, in the rare interviews she granted afterward, about the moment she stepped out of that limousine and saw her father kneeling on the marble floor of her own hotel, describing it as the single most important lesson she had ever received about what truly mattered in life, more valuable than any business deal or financial milestone she had ever achieved throughout her entire career. And so it was that a single winter evening, one that began with cruelty directed at an old man, simply for the crime of wearing worn clothing in the wrong place, ended instead as a testament to the quiet, unglamorous power of human decency, a reminder carried forward by everyone who witnessed it, that the truest measure of character reveals itself not in grand, calculated gestures performed for applause, but in the small, unwitnessed choices people make when they believe nothing significant is riding on the outcome. Nia Brooks never set out that night to change anyone's life, least of all her own. Yet in choosing simply to treat a stranger with the respect every human being deserves, she found herself woven permanently into a story far larger and more meaningful than she could have imagined. Standing there in the cold December air, offering nothing more than her coat and a few kind words to a man the world had, for reasons that never truly mattered, decided to overlook.